They say the sea forgets. But what if it remembers everything? Beneath the quiet blue of a forgotten Greek coast lies a city untouched by time, a place no map dares name, where stone streets dream in silence and memories echo louder than the waves. 5,000 years ago, Pavlopetri vanished beneath the water. No war, no fire, no farewell, just silence. And since then, the sea has kept its secret. But now, something stirs. A woman haunted by dreams that aren't hers. A city designed to remember, not the living, but the dead. And a truth so old, even history has tried to forget it. This is not just a tale of ruins and legends. It's a story of sacrifice, of memory, of a city built to outlive time itself, and of the woman destined to return. If you listen closely, you'll hear it too. The water calling your name. The past waiting to be unlocked. Welcome to Pavlopetri, where the sea remembers, and time never truly ends. Because once you begin this story, you won't be able to look away. He came back pale, gasping, claiming the seabed whispered his name. They thought it was nitrogen narcosis, or maybe a panic attack brought on by the depth. That's what the Coast Guard said. That's what the local dive crew settled on when they closed their logbooks and packed their gear. That's what the doctors whispered when they kept him overnight in the clinic outside Neapolis. But I knew better. His name was Alexios. A marine biologist with more ambition than caution, more curiosity than fear. We had grown up combing the rocky shores of southern Laconia, drawn to the sea not just by its beauty, but by the stories it kept swallowing. Ships that vanished in clear weather. Sounds that came from no vessel. Echoes bouncing through ancient underwater canyons like memory itself was trapped down there, looking for a way out. He never believed in the legends, until the sea said his name. It was late autumn when he took the boat out, alone, against warnings of unstable currents. He said he wanted to scan an anomaly detected by satellite, a square pattern that didn't belong in nature. It lay just off the coast near a place the old fishermen still avoided. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was too quiet. No fish, no birds, no sounds above or below. Just stillness, like a breath being held. When I asked him why he'd go alone, he smiled the way people smile before doing something foolish. "I won't be long," he said. "If it's nothing, I'll be back before lunch. If it's something," he left the rest hanging. He didn't come back for dinner. They found his boat adrift, gear scattered, sonar scanner still running. One tank empty, the other half full. And in the middle of the control console, a notebook, sealed in a plastic bag, with only 3 words scribbled in haste. "The city breathes." I was the one who went through the sonar data. Frame by frame, ping by ping. I saw the ruins before I understood what they were. Symmetrical streets, foundations, domes, and colonnades, lying impossibly perfect under layers of silt. Not random, not tectonic leftovers. This was a planned city. But the final frame, the very last sonar image before the feed cut out, before the scanner failed, it showed something else. A shape. A human figure, standing upright on the seabed. Still, too still, facing the scanner. And behind it, the faint outline of a gate. That was the first time I heard the name Pavlopetri. Not from the modern maps, but from an older source, my grandfather's weather journal, tucked away in a locked drawer. He had written about a village by the sea, swallowed by Poseidon himself, where the tides carried the voices of the drowned. Where people vanished and returned changed, or didn't return at all. In Greek, the name meant Paul and Peter. But even in church, no one spoke it. It had become a warning, not a place. I remember sitting alone in Alexios's empty room, staring at his dive footage. There was something in the audio, a low-frequency hum, steady, rhythmic. Almost like breath. When I filtered the static, amplified the lower bands, I thought I heard words. Not clear, not human, but words. And then flame, whispered, just once. The sea had said his name first. Now it said mine. I was terrified, but I was also the only one who believed him. And so I went. The next morning, I took his boat and followed his exact route. I anchored at the same GPS coordinates. The water was unnaturally calm, like glass cooled by something beneath. Schools of fish stayed wide of the area, breaking off in perfect spirals. No birds circled overhead. No insects buzzed by the shore. The sea held its breath again. I geared up, checked my oxygen twice, set the sonar to record, and I descended into silence. The world narrowed as I sank. Light faded. Pressure grew. But below, a glow waited, pale, blue-green, as if the ruins themselves radiated memory. Then I saw it. Pavlopetri. Not scattered stones, but streets. Corners. Foundations perfectly carved in grid-like precision. Walls still standing after 5,000 years. Doorways arched with impossible craftsmanship. It was as if the sea had chosen not to destroy, but to preserve. And as I drifted closer, I understood why. This wasn't a city that had sunk by accident. It had been hidden, deliberately. There were symbols carved on the stone, not Greek, not linear A or B, but something older. Shapes that hurt to look at, patterns that shifted when I tried to draw them later. At the center of the ruins was a stone platform, circular, with 7 concentric rings etched into it. And in the center, a pedestal, broken. As I hovered above it, my comms crackled. A whisper. No words this time. Just breath. And then, just beyond the rings, I saw it, the gate. Or what looked like one. 2 pillars, standing upright, impossibly tall, with something between them, not quite a door, not quite a shadow. It shimmered, and it pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat. I drifted closer, and there, standing in front of it, was a figure. Human. Unmoving. Not floating. Not drifting like a corpse would. Just standing. Facing me. I blinked. Checked my instruments. Oxygen normal. No sign of hallucination. But the figure didn't vanish. It didn't wave. It didn't move. But somehow, I knew it was him. Alexios. Or what was left of him. I tried to speak through the comm, but nothing came out. My body wouldn't respond. My hands shook. I reached for the scanner. The figure took 1 step forward. And then everything went black. I awoke on the boat, gasping. Like him. No memory of how I'd surfaced. No wounds. No damage to my suit. But my tank was full. Only the sonar scanner had changed. It had stopped recording after that final frame. The same frame. The gate. The figure. Still standing. Still watching. I tried to tell the Coast Patrol, the university, the archaeologists. They said it was impossible. That Pavlopetri was known, already documented. A minor Bronze Age ruin, not some ancient Atlantis. But they had never seen what I had. Never heard the breath in the silence. Never felt time stop. The next day, I went to find Alexios's data again. It was gone. Erased. His hard drive wiped clean. Only the notebook remained, those 3 words. The city breathes. But what no one else knew, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I had taken something from that dive. A fragment of stone. It was tucked inside my suit when I woke. Rough, sharp-edged, carved with one of the symbols. It should have been dead material. But it was warm. Still is. And some nights, when the moon is full, it hums. Not loud. Not angry. But patient. Waiting. There are places beneath the world that don't want to be found. Places built to keep something out, or something in. I believe Pavlopetri is one of those places. It is not just Europe's oldest submerged city. It is a prison built before history had language. And it is waking up. The next morning, I returned to the pier where I docked the boat. Alexios's dive mask was hanging from a nail on the post, dripping wet, as if it had just come out of the water. But no one had seen anyone approach. And there, scratched into the wood beside it, were new words. In his handwriting. She knows now. Don't let her remember. And that was when I realized the city didn't just whisper your name. It took it. And when it gave it back, you weren't the same. 5,000 years under the sea, and yet their walls still breathe. That was the first line in her grandfather's journal. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded with salt, but the handwriting hadn't trembled. Each word was drawn with intent, like the strokes of a man who had seen something so ancient, so impossible, that his only escape was to etch it down before memory could rot it into a lie. Eleni had never met him. He'd vanished when her mother was only 9, leaving behind a widow and a strange legacy of silence. The family never spoke of him again, as if his name, Nicholas Dracos, were some forgotten ghost best kept in its grave. But he had been an archaeologist once. Brilliant, some said. Mad, others whispered. A man who stopped digging in dirt and started chasing phantoms under the sea. And now she was standing on the same Laconian coast where he had last been seen. A scholar like him, trained in institutions that revered the classical world but feared what didn't fit their timelines. Unlike him, she still had a reputation to lose. But the journal had pulled her here. She hadn't even known it existed until her mother died and left her a single key, not to a house or a vault, but to a locked drawer inside an old, sea-worn desk. And within it, wrapped in linen like some relic, was the notebook. The journal spoke of Pavlopetri not as a site, but as a living organism. The city, he had written, was not destroyed by time. It was buried by design, by fear, as a warning. Eleni had laughed at first, the sort of poetic exaggeration found in old field notes. But then she'd seen the sonar scans recovered from a recent diver's report. The same square patterns, the same impossible architecture. And in that moment, something stirred inside her, not excitement, but a deep, unrelenting sense of recognition, as if she had seen these shapes before. Not in this life, but somewhere deeper. The Mediterranean sun glared off the sea as she stepped aboard the boat. The wind whispered softly, carrying the smell of brine and rusted memory. A local skipper took her out, silent, grizzled, refusing to cross himself but muttering under his breath every time they passed the headland. "They say the sea is calm," he finally said, "only when it's listening." She didn't reply. She was already watching the horizon, waiting for that moment when the sea would split its mirror and reveal what it had been hiding. The descent was smooth. The currents were light, unusually so for this part of the coast. Visibility stretched further than expected. The sun bled into the deep in long golden veins. And then, just as the sonar had predicted, the city rose from the gloom. Not broken rubble, but roads. Straight, exact, too deliberate for the era. Homes with defined thresholds. Courtyards that aligned with the movement of stars no longer in their ancient positions. An entire urban plan, preserved in death better than most cities survive in life. Eleni froze. It wasn't the scale of it, it was the arrogance. These weren't humble dwellings built to weather time. They were declarations of permanence, etched into stone and laid with such precision that it felt less like architecture and more like scripture. As if the city itself had been designed not for people, but for something watching. She drifted along the main avenue, noting columns, altars, fragments of pottery still half buried in sand. Everything was too intact. No signs of fire. No violent collapse. Just silence. A civilization that had stood up one day, walked into the sea, and chosen never to come back. Her camera recorded everything. Not for the university, they wouldn't believe it anyway, but for herself. For proof that she hadn't imagined it. That her grandfather hadn't been mad. He had written of this road. Called it the Path of Names. A place where the stones spoke, not in sound, but in weight, carrying the memories of all who had walked them. She thought it metaphor, until she touched the first slab. It was warm, only slightly, like sun-baked granite, but she was 12 meters beneath the surface. And then came the whisper, not from the sea, from within. A thought that wasn't hers, a name she didn't know, a child crying, a market bell ringing. Eleni jerked her hand away and nearly dropped the camera. Her breath quickened. Oxygen levels were stable, but her mind wasn't. She shook her head, tried to recenter, pushed on. The city had more to show her. She followed the road until it narrowed, leading not to a temple, but to a plaza with a strange depression in its center. Well, perhaps, or something else. It was ringed with 7 statues, each facing outward, each faceless. Time had erased their expressions, but not their postures. All of them stood with one arm raised and one hand open, as if warning or beckoning. Below them, carved into the floor, was a circular hatch. So ancient. Eleni hovered above it, stunned. Her grandfather had written of this place in the final entry before his disappearance. The chamber remains closed. The script resists translation. It is not Mycenaean. It is not Minoan. It predates all. I believe the city was built around it. To contain it. He had sketched the symbols, 3 spirals interlocked, surrounded by jagged lines like teeth or rays. She looked down now and saw them in real life. Exactly as he'd drawn them. No erosion. No coral. Just perfect, preserved madness. A script not seen in any Mediterranean record. Not linear, not Phoenician, not anything remotely Greek. Not even Sumerian. It didn't flow like language. It pulsed. Like it had been designed not to be read, but to be felt. And then, suddenly, Eleni felt watched. She turned, slowly, scanning the open ruins. No movement. No fish. No divers. Nothing. Just her and the silence. But she knew. Something had seen her. She drifted back, slowly, heart hammering, trying not to stir the silt too much. The chamber pulsed once, not physically, but inside her skull. A pressure, then a release. Like a thought trying to find its way out. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. They didn't sink. They were buried. Not destroyed. Not forgotten. Buried. Willingly. The question was, what had they buried with them? The camera feed began to glitch. She tapped the housing. It flickered, stuttered, froze. Then the audio kicked on, unprompted, and she heard something impossible. A heartbeat. Steady, but rhythmic. Not hers. Not human. The statues seemed to lean in. She backed away, slowly, until the heartbeat faded. Until the symbols stopped pulsing. She returned to the main road, head spinning. And that's when she saw it. A figure, half buried in silt, slumped against a wall. A body, or what remained of one. Not ancient. Not from 5,000 years ago. The dive suit was modern. Greek Navy issue. But the name patch was eroded. She reached out, brushing away the silt. Underneath, a diving journal. Inside it, waterlogged pages, mostly illegible. Except one. Written in a familiar hand. Her grandfather's. It was a letter. To the one who carries my blood. If you are reading this, the chamber has called you too. You must leave now. Before it knows your name. She dropped the book. Her name echoed faintly in her head. Not spoken, but remembered. The sea knew her now. She surfaced quickly. Too quickly. But the pain in her chest was nothing compared to the weight in her mind. The skipper was waiting, eyes wide. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. She sat in silence the whole ride back. That night, she dreamed of Pavlopetri. Only it wasn't ruins. It was alive. Lit with golden fire. Voices echoed through its halls. The faceless statues now bore the likeness of her own family. And in the center plaza, the sealed chamber cracked open, light pouring out like blood. And at its heart stood a woman who looked exactly like Eleni. Smiling. Weeping. Waiting. When she awoke, her pillow was soaked with seawater. And the symbol, the interlocked spirals, was drawn on her window in condensation. She hadn't done it. She didn't know how. But something had followed her back. Pavlopetri wasn't just a ruin. It was a question that had waited 5 millennia for an answer. And now it had found her. The symbols matched none on record, except one. It took Eleni 3 nights to find the pattern. 3 nights of no sleep, no warmth, only the whisper of salt on her skin and the relentless pull of the sea in her dreams. Her grandfather's letter had warned her. The chamber had called. Now it would wait for her to understand. Back in her small, stone-walled rental in the hills above Neapolis, she laid out the photographs from her dive, symbols carved into stone older than any Greek ruin, older even than the Minoans. Spirals, angular cuts, patterns that throbbed with meaning yet defied translation. They weren't just writing. They felt alive. She compared them to everything she had, Mycenaean, Phoenician, even obscure Anatolian dialects. Nothing fit. Nothing even came close. Until she opened the one folder most archaeologists had long given up on. Linear, a language never fully deciphered. A ghost script from the Minoans, buried by time and fire. Most dismissed it as untranslatable, but her grandfather had believed otherwise. And so did she. On the third page of his notes was a single phrase, translated with hesitation. When the sky sings thrice, the gate shall stir. She froze. The phrase was nonsense. Poetic. But one symbol in it matched something she had seen on the sealed chamber. Not identical, evolved. Sharper. More precise. As if it had aged backward. She pulled up the latest sonar scans, overlaying the symbols across the plaza. The carvings weren't random. They were laid in a circular spiral, a design that mirrored a celestial model. She mapped it again, not by architecture, but by constellation. And that's when it hit her. It wasn't language. It was time. The carvings weren't telling a story. They were marking an event, an alignment of stars, predicted from 5,000 years ago. A celestial configuration so rare it had only occurred twice in recorded history. The next appearance? In 6 days. She stared at the date, the orbit diagrams, the alignment between the 3 constellations, Cassiopeia, Lyra, and Cygnus, and the symbol on the gate. It was too perfect to be coincidence. Someone, or something, had carved a clock into the seabed. And what happened the last time the stars aligned? Eleni felt her heartbeat in her throat. She remembered the dreams, the whispering beneath her skull, the warmth in the stones that had no right to be warm, the statues watching, the heartbeat she heard in her helmet. All of it, somehow, led to this. She had to return. The next morning, she descended again. The sea didn't resist. It felt like it expected her now, like it had opened its arms. She moved faster this time, her mind sharp, her goal clear. Back to the sealed chamber. The 7 statues stood where they always had, faceless, eroded, and somehow even more solemn in their silence. The hatch in the plaza was still closed, its symbols pulsing faintly as her light swept over them. She knelt beside it, brushing away new silt. And then she saw it. Something had changed. A new symbol. Not etched. Grown. Like a coral that had bloomed overnight. It was the same shape as the one in her dream. A single eye, carved in perfect symmetry. At its center, a hollow depression, just the size of a fingertip. She hesitated, then reached out. The moment her skin touched the stone, the world convulsed. Not outside, inside her head. Her ears rang. Her vision split in two. For an instant, she saw herself standing in the chamber, and also saw through the eyes of someone else. A woman cloaked in white, her face painted in ceremonial ash, her hands trembling as she sealed the chamber for the first time. And then the memory flooded in. Not hers. Thousands of years old. But real. The woman had spoken the language of the drowned. Eleni didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling. Sacrifice. The priestess had not buried the city in shame or loss. She had buried it in mercy. To stop something that was never meant to rise again. Eleni stumbled back. Her oxygen monitor beeped. She steadied herself. The chamber hadn't opened, but something inside it had stirred. And then the water changed. The clarity vanished. The temperature rose. From beneath the plaza, a current began to pulse upward. Not tidal, not natural. It flowed like breath. The stones beneath her hummed, vibrating softly against her fins. The 7 statues trembled, just slightly. The water filled with particles of light, as if dust from a broken star had poured into the sea. She looked down. The eye was open, not carved. Open. Its center glowed faintly, gold, then white, then deep ocean blue. She hovered, staring into it, and again the voice, not in sound but in thought, whispered. 6 days remain. The pulse stopped. The water stilled. And the glow faded. But the warmth in her suit remained. Something had been unlocked. Not physically. Psychically. The chamber knew her now. And it had started counting. That night, Eleni couldn't sleep. She didn't try. She sat on the terrace of her rented room, overlooking the moonlit sea, the waves gentler than they should have been. Everything was calm. Too calm. She opened her grandfather's journal again, flipping to the page she had once thought to be nonsense. A passage jumped out now, one she hadn't paid attention to before. We search for ruins because we want to find ourselves in the past. But Pavlopetri is not a mirror. It is a memory that remembers us first. She ran her finger along the ink, wondering what it meant. The next entry was more direct. There was no war, no flood, no gods, just a decision, one they could never take back. So they wrote it in stone and drowned it in silence. She thought of the symbols again, the predictive pattern. Not prophecy, but recurrence. A cycle. Whatever had happened was going to happen again. She began charting every strange alignment Pavlopetri's layout matched. The plaza resembled the Phaistos disk. The chamber matched the proportions of Mesopotamian ziggurats. And the eye symbol, it mirrored one found in pre-dynastic Egypt, thousands of kilometers away. How could one city know so many languages before they even existed? Unless Pavlopetri had come first, and all others had borrowed its memory. But who, then, had written its language? And why could she understand pieces of it, as if she had always known? She didn't realize she was crying until her hands felt wet. Not from sadness, from fear. A fear that felt inherited, as if it had lived in her blood for generations, waiting for this exact moment to wake up. The following evening, just as the sky turned the color of bruised wine, she stood at the shoreline. The sea was too still again. No gulls, no wind, as if the coast held its breath. She watched the horizon, and for just a moment, less than a breath, the water in the distance lifted. Not a wave, a form, like something vast shifting beneath the surface. Then it vanished. She blinked, questioned her eyes. But she knew. The city was stirring. The countdown had begun. And she was no longer a visitor. She was a participant. Inside the chamber, somewhere deep under the stone, an ancient mechanism creaked. One not powered by metal or gears, but by memory. The eye had opened, and now it was watching. It did not speak, it remembered for her. The first dream came just before dawn, between the weight of sleep and waking, in that fragile space where reason bends and memory begins to bleed. Eleni didn't feel herself fall asleep. One moment, she was staring at the spiral symbol on the inside of her wrist, a mark that hadn't been there days before, and the next, she was underwater again. But it wasn't Pavlopetri as she had seen it. It was Pavlopetri alive. Sunlight shimmered above in pale ribbons. Streets bustled with motion, children laughing, merchants shouting in a language she should not have understood, but did. Columns gleamed. Cloth danced on balconies. Statues stood with faces unweathered by time. There was music, rhythmic, strange, haunting. Flutes and drums, yet not like any she'd ever heard. She walked the city barefoot, her body light, dressed in robes of blue stitched with gold, unfamiliar to her touch, but fitted like memory. No one questioned her presence. They greeted her, bowed to her, whispered reverently, "She remembers." But she didn't. Not yet. The dream shifted, like waves changing current. She stood at the edge of the central plaza, the one she had seen buried in silt days before, now swept clean and shining in the sun. At its center stood a woman, dressed in ivory, her hair braided with obsidian and bone. Her eyes were pale silver, too pale to be natural. And when she spoke, Eleni understood. "You have returned." The voice echoed not in her ears, but in her mind. It was not sound, but memory, an old one, worn smooth by time and repetition. "I don't know you," Eleni said. The woman smiled. "Sadly, you did, before the sea took the truth." The plaza darkened. The sun above dimmed. The people vanished. Only the two of them remained. "I am the oracle," the woman said, "bound to the city's sleep. I do not speak. I remember. And you are the reason we remember still." Eleni's breath caught. She tried to step back, but her feet would not move. "What happened here?" she asked. "Why was the city buried?" The oracle turned, gesturing to the edge of the plaza. And there, beneath the surface of the dream, Eleni saw it. The gate, not broken and buried as she had seen it on the seabed, but complete, massive. arched in black stone veined with pulsing light. A heartbeat echoed from it, steady and slow. They opened it, the oracle whispered. Who? The first ones. The ones who heard the song beneath the earth and mistook it for a god. Eleni didn't understand. The oracle continued. They sought knowledge, eternal memory. They built the chamber to hold what they found. A mind not born of man nor nature. Something that listens. A silence stretched between them. Thick, dreadful. We tried to seal it, the oracle said. But memory does not forget. And neither does the sea. The vision shimmered again. The plaza cracked. Buildings burned without flame. The music twisted into screams. Eleni saw figures run, fall, disappear into smoke. And above it all, the gate. Open. Light poured from it like a wound. Not golden. Not holy. Pale and hungry. And from it came shapes, not beings, but echoes. Things that moved like thought and struck like memory. People collapsed, clutching their heads, weeping. Some forgot their names. Others forgot they were ever human. We did not drown, the oracle said. We chose the sea. And then it was gone. Eleni woke gasping. Her skin was cold. Her sheets soaked. But not with sweat. With seawater. She checked her clock. It was just after 3:33 a.m. And on the wall across from her bed, a handprint. Salt-stained. What? Smaller than hers. She rose slowly, heart pounding, checking the door, the windows, all locked. But on the floor by the window, a single seashell. Fresh, still dripping. The next day, Eleni returned to the dive site. She had no plan. No research goal. Only the weight of the dream, if dream it was, and the echo of the oracle's words. She descended alone. No divers. No sonar. No oxygen alarm. Just her, the deep, and the city that had begun to remember her. This time, the water felt warmer. Not welcoming, but aware. The city looked unchanged, but as she swam through its avenues, she saw shadows in the corners. Movements at the edge of vision. Her light flickered once, twice. Then she reached the plaza again. The statues were different now. Not physically, they hadn't moved, but they were facing inward, toward the sealed chamber. Her chest tightened. The eye on the stone was closed, but the symbols had changed. New spirals. Smaller, tighter, and one line carved newly. The city must sleep. She touched the words. Heat surged through her fingers. She reeled back. Her suit's sensors spiked, 8 degrees Celsius increase. The stone was burning. She turned to leave, and heard the voice again. Not the oracle's. Her own. But younger. Afraid. You promised it would stay sealed. Eleni spun around. No one. But her dive recorder was playing. A voice that wasn't hers, but had her cadence. Her breath. Speaking in the language of the drowned. She backed away. And the water darkened. A ripple in the current. A shape moving between the ruins. She surfaced in record time. By the time she reached the boat, her hands were shaking. She pulled off her helmet. And she remembered something she hadn't before. A lullaby. In a language she didn't know, but had once sung as a child. That night, the dream returned. This time, Eleni stood in the chamber. The gate was cracked open, only slightly. The oracle knelt at its threshold. Her face streaked with tears. You led the sealing, she said. You held the key, but your mind broke. You chose to forget. Eleni shook her head. I'm not her. You are, or you were. It makes no difference. What matters is this. The oracle looked up. The stars will align in 4 days. The chamber pulsed. The gate whispered. If the city wakes, the sea will remember. And it is not kind. Eleni's voice trembled. What happens if the sea remembers? The oracle rose and said, then all who live will forget they were ever human. And the gate opened wider, and the light was no longer light. It was a memory sharpened into a blade. Eleni woke screaming, her voice raw. The mark on her wrist now bled slightly, as if ink had turned to wound. On her bedside table, her grandfather's journal lay open. A page she hadn't seen before. Said, she will return when the sky sings. She will dream in our name. But if she remembers fully, it will be too late. And beneath the text, a drawing, a star chart, the same alignment. For days, she stepped out into the morning air, and the waves were already beginning to rise. History only remembers the victors. But what if the city tried to save the world and failed? Eleni hadn't slept for 2 days. Not truly. Not without slipping into visions stitched from someone else's past. The oracle's warnings echoed endlessly in her mind. The city must sleep. The sea must not awaken. But the symbols on the stones pulsed brighter now. The dreams were no longer scattered fragments. They were memories. Coherent, directed, deliberate. And this time, she didn't resist. That night, she lit no candles. She closed her eyes beneath a sky too quiet to trust, and she let herself fall. Into the dream. Into Pavlopetri. The city was loud. Not with chaos, but with life. Bells rang across sun-baked plazas. Priests in crimson robes chanted beside crystalline pools. Dancers spun through alleyways of sandstone and shadow. The marketplace overflowed with color, with fruit from distant lands, with fabric that shimmered like river light. The sea, as always, lapped at the edge of the city, calm and listening. But beneath it all, tension. Eleni stood near the steps of the great chamber. This time, she wore no dive suit, no helmet. Her hands bore the gold and black spirals of ritual paint, her wrists bound in ceremonial leather. People bowed as she passed. They called her by a name that wasn't hers. Thalia. And she knew it. Deep in the marrow of her bones, she knew it had once been hers. She had walked these streets before. But now, the faces that greeted her no longer smiled. The people moved too quickly. Whispers chased her steps like wind through broken reeds. They spoke of rumors, of visions seen by the priests, of messages passed through sleep, of disappearances beneath the oracle's temple, of time behaving strangely. At the eastern edge of the city, near a grove of dying fig trees, she saw them, the rebels. Hidden in shadow, marked by symbols older than any script. A man with eyes as black as volcanic glass nodded at her. Behind him, a woman, scarred from fire, carrying scrolls wrapped in torn velvet, clutched her wrist in pain. The same spiral burned into her skin. It was not birthmark. It was initiation. The man stepped forward and spoke softly. "We are the last." Eleni didn't need to ask. She understood. These were not traitors. They were guardians. Witnesses. Carriers of truth the city had buried along with its own conscience. They called themselves Mnemones, the remembers. And what they remembered was terrifying. Long before the sea claimed Pavlopetri, long before even its first stone had been laid, there was something buried beneath. Not a resource, not a god, but a presence. A current beneath time. Not alive, not dead, but aware. The priests called it Chronean, the deep time. They believed it could unlock eternity. That if properly channeled, it could store not just knowledge, but identity itself. Minds could be preserved, moments repeated, history perfected. The chamber had been built as a vessel, but the power was too vast. It didn't just store memory, it devoured it, shuffled it, wove it into dreams and nightmares. Those who touched it forgot their names, then their families, then their own nature. The oracle had begged the ruling council to stop. But the elite, the eminent line, had already begun the rituals. They believed they could master time, rewrite loss, avoid death, ascent. The Mnemones saw what was coming. A fracture, not in stone, in memory, a tear in time itself. So they plotted an uprising. Not with swords, not with fire, but with silence. They would seal the chamber, bury the gate, sink the city if they had to. Let history forget them to keep the world from remembering what waited beneath. But the rebellion failed. Too late, too few. And yet, someone had triggered the collapse. Someone had finished the ritual in reverse. Someone had offered their own mind to seal the fracture. And in doing so, condemned the city to sleep. The dream darkened. Faces blurred. Time skipped. Eleni gasped. She stood now in a high chamber, stone walls spiraled with carvings. The rebels knelt in a circle, chanting. At the center, she, Thalia, stepped forward, holding a blade forged from obsidian and starlight. The oracle wept. "You will forget," she whispered. "We will all forget." And then Eleni plunged the blade into her own chest. The dream shattered. She woke with blood on her lips, but no wound, only pain, a phantom grief that didn't belong to her but had nested in her ribs all the same. The next morning, the tide had pulled back more than it should have, exposing jagged stones once hidden, statues that hadn't seen air in 5,000 years. The countdown had begun. 3 days until the alignment. 3 days until the seal would crack. Eleni sat by the water, holding her grandfather's journal. The ink on the final page had blurred, but the pressure of his hand still lived in the paper. She traced the groove of his words with her fingers. "We buried the truth, but the sea remembers." Now she knew what he meant. The rebellion hadn't failed. It had worked, but only barely, and only because someone had given everything, even their own identity, to keep the seal closed. Herself, Thalia, whoever she had once been. The oracle had said memory doesn't forget. But what if time did? What if the world had gone on, oblivious, while Pavlopetri, while she, kept the line? Now that line was fraying. That night, the dream returned. But this time, it wasn't a vision. It was a warning. The oracle knelt beside a fountain, its water dark and rising. She held a candle that would not light. Around them, the city trembled. Buildings flickered, half stone, half shadow. The gate pulsed like a wound. "You opened the chamber," the oracle said, "and now it sees you again." Eleni whispered, "What do I do?" The oracle reached for her hand and placed a key in it. Not metal, not carved. Memory. "You must do what you did before," she said. "Lead." And behind her, the rebels rose from shadow. Silent, waiting, trusting. Eleni turned, faced the gate, and stepped forward. The city screamed. She woke in tears. On her wrist, the spiral now glowed faintly. Her reflection in the window was not her own, but the face of a woman 5,000 years gone. And in her chest, a strange peace. Not calm, but readiness. Pavlopetri was not destroyed by hubris or flood. It was silenced by love, by sacrifice, by a people who chose to be forgotten to protect what mattered more. Now, as the stars began to shift in the sky once more, the question rose like the tide. Would Eleni remember in time? Or would the sea awaken again? On the 7th moon, the city would vanish, or so the prophecy warned. That line had echoed through every dream Eleni had since the oracle returned to her. It haunted the back of her thoughts, carved itself into the rhythm of her footsteps, played like a forgotten song each time the waves touched her feet. At first, she thought it was metaphor, poetic dread written into myth. But now she knew better, because the moon had begun to change. It watched her from the sky, colder, clearer, and closer than before. And the sea beneath it had grown strange. Less like water, more like a surface waiting to break. She sat alone near the cliff that overlooked the submerged city, her grandfather's journal beside her, a fresh dive log in her lap, and a drawing. One she hadn't made. One she had found on her pillow the night before. It showed the priestess, not the oracle. Another, younger, fiercer, cloaked in silver. And she stood not before the sealed chamber, but above it, her arms raised to the sky. Behind her, the city burned. Before her, the moon. Eleni turned the page. A line was scrawled at the bottom, in a hand that did not match her grandfather's. Time is not a river. It is a tide. She closed the book, heart heavy. The visions were getting stronger. No longer passive. They pushed now, invaded her waking hours, blurred the edges of thought. She could feel time folding, not like a fabric, but like breath returning to a drowning mouth. She descended again that night. Into the city. Into the silence. The moment her light touched the ruins, the dreams returned. But she was no longer a witness. She was inside them. It began with music. Low, resonant. Not made by instruments, but by vibration. By language. She stood in a temple she had never seen, its walls covered in obsidian dust, its columns woven with vines that glowed in the dark. There, upon a dais of moonstone, stood the priestess. Not the oracle. The first. Her name came without thought. Lysithea. She turned, looked at Eleni, and Eleni felt her knees weaken, because it was her own face she saw. Younger, wilder, unscarred by memory, not yet burdened by sacrifice. Lysithea stepped forward and began to speak, not with sound, but with thought. Our world is not bound by time. It is wounded by it. She gestured behind her, to the sky, now visible through a dome of crystal above the temple. 7 moons, perfectly aligned. One for each age, one for each sacrifice. Eleni understood without needing to be told. The city had not waited for the stars. It had used them. Celestial alignments had opened something beneath the world. Something that lived not in space, but in when. The priestess had made a pact, not with gods, but with the moons. A being from beyond time had whispered through the alignment, offering a gift in exchange for obedience. To stop the decay of memory, to preserve everything, forever. No more death, no more forgetting. A city unburdened by the weight of time. Lysithea had said yes, and time had shattered. Not visibly, not suddenly, but slowly, painfully. The seasons stopped moving. The tide forgot how to rise. The children grew in body, but not in mind. Memories looped, names repeated, dreams returned unchanged. People began to remember things that had not happened yet, until the city broke. The temple cracked, and the being that had offered eternity began to hunger. Because the pact was never for balance. It was a trap, a way in. Through her, Lysithea had sealed the chamber herself, bound her own thoughts within the memory of the city, and the gate beneath Pavlopetri had been her tomb, but not of stone, of identity. She had scattered herself into dreams, into bloodlines, into whispers, waiting for someone to return when the cycle began again. And now Eleni stood in her place. The 7th moon was rising, and the pact had come to collect. She surfaced, choking on salt and grief. The air felt thinner than it had before. The wind no longer moved west. The stars were too bright. And the moon was bleeding. A dark red line crept across its face like an eye closing. The lunar eclipse had begun. She returned to the shore, dripping, breathless. And the water behind her, the water that lay still above the sleeping city, began to boil. Not with heat, with memory. Shapes twisted beneath the surface. Not bodies, not fish, events. A wedding that had already happened. A funeral not yet held. A child being born in the arms of someone already dead. Time surged backward, forward, then snapped still. Eleni collapsed to her knees, watching the water ripple. From its center, a tower rose. One she had not seen before, but silent, geometric in a way that defied age. It was not made by hands. It had grown, and it had been waiting for her. That night, the final vision came. Not during sleep, during breath. She sat with her back against the cliff wall, and she closed her eyes, not to rest, but to see. Lysithea returned to her. This time not in temple robes, not in sacred light, but in chains, bound in time itself, trapped in the moment she had broken. Her voice was raw now, no longer grand, just tired. "You must end what I began," she said. "You must refuse the gift." Eleni cried. "How?" "The seal must not be broken," Lysithea whispered, "even if it means burying us again." "But the memories, the people, they are echoes," Lysithea said, "not lives. If they rise, the world will fall into memory and forget itself." Eleni felt it then, the pull. The city wanted to wake. It missed being alive, but it was not alive. It was a dream that had drowned. And dreams, if kept too long, become nightmares. She reached for the spiral on her wrist. It burned beneath her skin, and the moon turned fully black. The stars blinked once. The waves fell silent. And then, from the tower beneath the sea, came a sound. A hum, but endless. as if the world itself had started to remember something it swore never to recall. Eleni looked out over the dark water and whispered, "Not yet, please, not yet." But the sea had already heard her. The city was a vessel, not for people, for memory. It began, as it often did now, with a dream Eleni couldn't wake from. But this time, she wasn't drifting through visions of Pavlopetri's past. She was submerged in them, drowning not in water, but in recollection. Fragments of lives brushed past her like shoals in deep current. A child singing a lullaby in a language not spoken for millennia, an old man weeping over a grave no longer marked, a woman screaming in joy as her newborn's first cry shattered silence in a stone-walled home long collapsed beneath the sea. None of these memories were hers, and yet they hurt, because they were alive. She woke gasping, the taste of salt water in her mouth, her fingers trembling. The notebook she kept beside her bed was open, though she hadn't touched it. On its page, a single line had been written in her own handwriting. "I am becoming too many people." The sun hadn't risen. The moon, still eclipsed, bled red light across the glass of her window. In the distance, the sea hissed. She understood, now, what Pavlopetri had truly been. Not a city, an ark. A machine built not of metal, but of architecture and intention, designed to house not bodies, but minds. A network, a living archive, a memory chamber built to trap time inside stone. The chamber had never been a tomb. It was a library, and she had opened the front door. Later that day, she returned to the dive site. Not with hope, but with resignation. She no longer questioned the voices or the shifting symbols. The city was waking, and she was no longer a visitor, she was a key. The water was warm, too warm. Not from current, but from consciousness. It pulsed beneath her like breath. The dive computer read normal, but nothing felt natural. Schools of fish no longer swam here. Even the crabs that once crawled across the ancient streets were gone. Only silence remained, the silence of thoughts too full to speak. She descended to the plaza. The 7 statues faced the chamber once again. The spiral symbol had widened. More markings had appeared, branching, fractal, like neurons etched into stone. And at the center of the plaza, the eye she had once touched blinked. Not visibly, internally. She felt it behind her eyes, calling her forward. The chamber had opened. Eleni entered through a fissure in the floor, a crack not from collapse, but design. The interior of the chamber was vast, round, and impossibly smooth. No tool marks, no seams. It was as if the walls had been grown, not built. And those walls moved, not visibly, but they pulsed with memory. Not memory as we know it, not stories or images or sounds, but weight. Emotional gravity. Grief pressed against her chest like stone. Joy shimmered like light just out of reach. Guilt crawled down her spine. And then confusion, as if the chamber itself couldn't tell who she was, or how many. The carvings weren't just decorative. They were entries. Each symbol a person, each etching a life. Thousands of them, stacked, spun, layered into the walls like code. Except there was no alphabet, just the feeling each one gave her as she passed. Fear, longing, hunger, hope. Some echoed, some screamed, some fell silent the moment she turned her gaze. It was beautiful and horrifying, because it hadn't worked. This was not a memory archive. It was a memory graveyard, and something had gone wrong. Her grandfather had called it a psychic virus, not literal, but metaphorical. A corruption, a thought too vast, too alien, too hungry to be held by human minds. It had bled into the machine the moment the pact was made. A single, unfiltered truth from the being beyond the moons, and it infected the network like rot in the foundation of a temple. The memories had stopped playing. They had started feeding. Each person added to the archive had slowly been consumed. Their identities blurred, shattered, recombined. People remembered themselves wrong. Lived memories they had never lived. Woke screaming from lives they had never known. And then they stopped waking at all. The walls weren't humming. They were mourning. Because the city hadn't just sealed its people. It had trapped them. Eleni moved deeper into the chamber, drawn toward the central column, a smooth, towering structure in the heart of the room, rising from floor to ceiling with no visible support. It wasn't stone. It was translucent, and inside it, shadows flickered. Ships, not physical, but present, like thoughts trying to remember themselves. And as she approached, they began to speak. Not aloud. Inside her, all at once. I was Arios, I was a farmer, I was happy, I loved her. Where's my son? Why do I keep dying? Who is in my skin? The stars won't stop moving, make it stop. I'm sorry I opened the gate, I didn't mean to, please, let me go, let me go. Eleni fell to her knees, clutching her head. The voices, thousands, screamed inside her, then fell silent all at once. And one remained. The oracle. You opened the memory gate. Eleni looked up. The central column had shifted. Inside, the face. Her own. But ancient. Terrified. I did this, she whispered. I tried to save them. You tried to preserve them, the oracle answered. But the memory could not be controlled. It needed a mind, Eleni said. It needed yours, the oracle said. And suddenly she understood. She had not opened the chamber by accident. She had designed it. In another life. She had believed that no life should ever be forgotten. That death was a cruelty, that memory was sacred. And so she built a way to store it. A way to cheat loss. And in doing so, she had doomed them all. The being beyond time, the one they had made the pact with, had no use for memory, only for access. And now, through her, it had begun to rise again. The chamber walls pulsed. The symbols began to rearrange. The stories of thousands twisted in her mind. She saw betrayals, battles, marriages, prayers, crimes, children who never grew old, lovers who never died, kings who ruled 1,000 years without ever aging. She lived all of them in seconds. And then, silence. The walls dimmed. The water thickened. She tried to move. Her limbs didn't respond. The chamber had locked her in. At the edge of her hearing, the surface began to crackle. The water above Pavlopetri had begun to boil again. But not from heat. From memory. From the city trying to rise. She screamed. The sound went nowhere. The thoughts inside her multiplied. Names she didn't know filled her throat. And just before darkness closed in, she remembered one thing clearly. A whisper in the back of her mind. You are not here to awaken them. You are here to forgive them. And then let them go. She opened her eyes. And the walls were glowing. Each symbol now burning. Each memory rising. Each ghost remembering. And the chamber pulsed like a heart, ready to burst. No city is built without sacrifice. But Pavlopetri required more. Long before Eleni dove into the chamber, before her dreams bled with ghosts and time collapsed inward like breath held too long, she thought the city had been born from brilliance, from ancient visionaries who mapped the stars and bent stone to their will. But she had been wrong. It hadn't been vision. It had been punishment. The memory didn't come to her in a dream this time. It arrived as a flood. During the eclipse's final hour, as the water churned above the ruins and the boiling sea shimmered like glass, she stood on the edge of the shore and felt her knees buckle. And then the past swallowed her whole. They were not heroes. They were not priests. They were philosophers. And they had been exiled, banished from the kingdoms of early men for ideas too dangerous to entertain. That thought could be preserved outside the mind. That identity was not fixed to flesh. That the soul, if it even existed, could be rewritten, transferred, replicated, perhaps even stored. They were 12 in total, known in whispered myths as the architects. And they found the edge of the world where the waves moved slower, where the sky bent differently, where the water did not reflect the stars, but remembered them. They did not build Pavlopetri on the coast. They carved it into the current of something far older, a naturally occurring field of quantum memory held in the sea itself. A convergence of thought and salt, where the fabric between past and present grew thin. The earliest stones of Pavlopetri were laid not with mortar, but with blood. Each of the 12 bound their consciousness to the city's foundation, not symbolically, not ritually, but deliberately. They believed death was a misperception, that if they encoded their identities into the sea's flow, they could achieve not just immortality, but perfect continuity. They called it hydrothymia, the binding in water. And it worked. At first, the visions became clearer for Eleni now. She saw their faces, not masked, not mythologized, but real, wrinkled with hunger, eyes bright with madness and hope. One of them, a man with the same amber-brown eyes as her grandfather, spoke into the sea. "Let us become what the body cannot hold. Let us be light in water." They designed the chamber to receive memory. They etched consciousness into walls like scribes writing on wet clay. They built altars that listened, pools that remembered, and from them they birthed Pavlopetri, not a place to live, but a vessel to become. The city was their experiment, but experiments rarely stay in the control of their makers. Over time, the lines began to blur. Thought corrupted thought. Identity unraveled. The sea, they learned too late, did not differentiate. It absorbed everything: joy, fear, hatred, betrayal, and gave it all back. And with each new life added to the archive, the memories twisted. The dead forgot they were dead. The living forgot they had ever been alive. One by one, the architects disappeared. Not physically, but into the current. Eleni opened her eyes underwater, pulled back into her dive. She was in the chamber again, but it was changing. The walls spun with new patterns, not ancient, recent. Her dive notes, her journal entries, her childhood lullaby, her dreams. The machine was now storing her. And from the central column, a voice spoke. Not out loud, but intimately. "Eleni." She froze. That name, the way it was said, so reassuring, familiar. "Eleni, don't be afraid." She turned slowly toward the core, and inside it, floating like a memory made solid, was the face of a man she had only seen in black and white photographs. Nicholas Dracos, her grandfather, Uniged, beware, and still alive. Not in body, but in stream. Her mouth went dry inside her regulator. The voice echoed in her mind, warm and frayed. "I waited for you. I told you in the letters. The city remembers us. It holds us. I thought I could help, but I couldn't get out." Eleni's eyes blurred with salt. "Grandfather?" "I tried to map the breach," he said. "Tried to follow the current to its source. But the network collapsed. I don't know how long I've been here. The sea, it moves differently." She reached out to the column. He mimicked the gesture. "Plus, only memory between them. You can't stay," he said. "It's pulling you deeper." "I can bring you back," she whispered. "No," he said gently. "You mustn't." And then his eyes changed. Just slightly. The voice twisted. "Let her stay. She belongs here." Eleni recoiled. His image flickered. The walls around her pulsed, grief, pain, confusion. His voice returned, trembling. "It's in me now," he said. "It's in all of us. The thing they invited in. It's using us to stay alive." And then, "Run." The water thickened. The wall screamed. And the column fractured. She kicked away, heart racing as the chamber shook. But behind her, his voice still called. Not in madness, but in love. "I'll hold it back. Go." And then the chamber closed. Eleni surfaced into moonlight. The eclipse had passed. But the sea had not calmed. It churned with memory. And below her, her own voice now whispered through the current. "Let me in. Let me become." She stared at the waves and wept. Not for her grandfather, but for herself. Because now, she knew where the final key was hidden. Inside her. There was once a map that erased the place it pointed to. Eleni had always believed that maps were tools of discovery, instruments meant to reveal, to record, to preserve. But this map was different. It did not want to be seen. It did not want to be held. It had waited for centuries, buried in shadow, stitched in bloodline, passed through whispers. And now it had found her. She was still reeling from her last dive, her grandfather's voice lingering in her mind like mist after rainfall, his final warning pulsing with urgency. She had barely slept, unable to escape the image of his face, preserved in the memory stream of Pavlopetri, aware, fractured, resisting the same thing that had hollowed out so many others. Yet when she awoke, something had changed. On the wooden table by her bedside, her grandfather's journal had opened on its own. A page she'd never seen before had revealed itself, and on it, a sketch. Not of a ruin, not of a monument, but of her own face, surrounded by ancient symbols. Above it in his careful scrawl, "The map isn't paper, it's her." Beneath the sketch, coordinates, not for a place, for a depth, and a single name. Selenon the cartographer. She followed the lead to a forgotten archive in a crumbling coastal monastery where only dust and decay remained. A single monk, blind in one eye, ancient in posture, led her silently to the back of the hall, where brittle scrolls sat beneath glass. But one was missing. Eleni stared into the empty case until the monk spoke, his voice like wind through ash. It was never meant to be found. He said the map was a trap, that once seen, it would begin again. She asked him what happened to Selenon. The monk only whispered. He tried to unsee it, and lost his mind. She returned to the surface with more questions than answers. But she didn't need to search for the map. It had already begun to reveal itself. Later that night, as rain fell against the window, Eleni's skin began to itch. She looked in the mirror and saw tiny, pale lines emerging on her forearms. Not scars, not ink, but light. Faint glimmers forming patterns. Rings. Coordinates. Contours. A map blooming from within her. Etched not in ink, but in blood. It pulsed like veins. She staggered back, trembling. The cartographer hadn't drawn it on parchment. He had encoded it into her. Eleni understood then. She was not the first. She was the carrier. The city had marked her lineage. Her grandfather had only rediscovered what had always been inside him. A fragment of a curse passed on, generation after generation, waiting for one who would open the seal. She wasn't chosen. She was constructed. The architects had built Pavlopetri as a memory vessel, but someone had built her as the key. The next morning, the air felt wrong. Still heavy. The kind of silence that precedes the breaking of something sacred. She climbed the cliffs above the bay and looked out over the sea. And she froze. The horizon was empty. The tide had vanished. The ocean had pulled back farther than she'd ever seen. Hundreds of meters of seabed lay exposed, glistening in sunlight. And there, like a skeleton shaking free from centuries of burial, Pavlopetri. Fully revealed. For the first time in 5,000 years. Stone streets glistened under open sky. Temples rose like fossilized prayers. Columns wept salt. And at the heart of it all, the memory chamber, once buried, now open, stood like a wound made visible. And the walls whispered. Eleni didn't wait. She ran. Down the cliffs. Across the sands. Onto the seabed. The city breathed dry air. It had risen for her. And it remembered everything. She walked barefoot across the ancient roads, her skin still glowing faintly with the cartographic code. Statues turned as she passed. Shadows flickered along doorframes. Echoes of voices not spoken in thousands of years danced around her. At the center of the city, she found the cartographer's mark. A stone plinth, untouched by barnacle or rot. On it, a spiral carved in obsidian, lined with notches that pulsed like a heartbeat. She knelt, laid her hand upon it, and the ground shook, not violently, but deliberately, like something ancient adjusting in its sleep. The spiral glowed, the code on her skin aligned, and her mind was no longer hers. She stood in a room, not of stone, but thought. Selenon was there, not as a man, but a memory. Eyes wild, lips cracked. He paced, muttering. I told them. I drew it to hide it. The more perfect the map, the less real the place becomes. He turned to her, his eyes burning. You weren't supposed to find it. Eleni tried to speak, but couldn't. Selenon stepped forward, furious. I buried it in the blood. I coded it into lineages no one would trace. And yet here you are, drawn like the tide. He wept. Do you know what you are? She stared, He answered for her. A compass made of flesh, the last coordinate, the closing loop. And then the vision shattered. She awoke on the stones of Pavlopetri. Sunlight burned overhead, but the sky had changed. Clouds spiraled unnaturally. The wind turned cold, and on the far side of the horizon, a storm. Silent. Wrong. Eleni turned back toward the memory chamber. It pulsed, openware, and from it came a sound. Ancient. Not thunder, not voice, but thought, being born. She turned to run, but the sea was already returning. A massive wave rose at the edge of the exposed seabed. Slow, intentional, not pushed by wind, but called. The map inside her glowed brightly now, not passive, but urgent. And she understood the truth. The cartographer hadn't drawn the city to reveal it. He had encoded the map so precisely that by being found, the city would erase itself. A recursive loop of memory, a sacrifice of place to preserve the world. But now, with Eleni there, glowing, aligned, the loop was broken, and the city would not go quietly. The wind howled, stone cracked, the wave crashed, and the world turned white. When Eleni opened her eyes, the sea was above her again. The city had vanished, submerged, but not drowned, just waiting. The chamber sealed, the map gone from her skin, but in her mind, a final whisper. One part remains. It wasn't a city, it was a prison. For all her dives, for all the broken dreams and whispered warnings, Eleni had never fully grasped it until now. She'd seen the memory chamber. She'd heard the voices of the dead, wept at her grandfather's preserved thoughts, and felt the weight of the cartographer's encoded curse burning under her skin. But this truth was older, more dangerous, more final. Pavlopetri was never meant to be remembered, because it had been built to forget, not to enshrine history, but to bury it. The revelation didn't come in the water. It came in wind. 3 days after the sea reclaimed the exposed ruins, Eleni stood at the headland cliffs, watching the ocean breathe. Not with tide, with intention. The currents no longer followed weather. They pulsed like arteries. And in the stillness between gusts of air, she heard it. You are the key. The voice wasn't hers. It came from below. From beneath Pavlopetri. From something deeper than ruin or memory. A silence that spoke. The journal her grandfather left behind had one last compartment she hadn't discovered. Hidden in the binding, stitched with ancient thread. She tore it open and pulled out a scrap of cloth older than anything she had ever touched, olive brown, flaking at the edges, etched in markings older than linear A. A language of locks. And among those symbols, one glowed faintly beneath her touch. A sigil shaped like an eye, circled by what looked like a skeletal sea serpent devouring its own tail. She traced it, and her vision broke open. The world around her melted into cold light. She stood not in Greece, not in time, but in memory stripped of form. A darkness without sky, and beneath her, a shape. Sleeping, caged by stone and ritual. A city above it, a prison around it, and 12 figures standing in a circle, chanting in silence, bleeding into the earth. They weren't just builders. They were jailers. Philosophers exiled not for madness, but for knowledge. Knowledge of an artifact not made by any hand. An object that existed before language, before kings, before death. Not a weapon, not a god, but a breach. They had found it beneath the earth, where the ley lines fractured. A crystalline mass that shimmered with thought, warped time, bent identity. They couldn't destroy it, so they buried it. Not in rock, but in memory. They built Pavlopetri over the fracture, each street a chain, each stone a seal, each statue a guardian without eyes. The chamber wasn't the source. It was the last layer of protection. And now, the artifact was waking. Eleni woke in her bed, gasping. Her skin was cold, but the mark on her wrist, the spiral, now burned. Not metaphorically, physically. And with it came visions, quick, disjointed. A child staring into a pool and seeing an older version of herself looking back. A soldier trapped in a single breath for eternity. A diver who forgot his own name before surfacing. Memories weren't leaking anymore. They were escaping. That evening, she returned to the sea. Not to dive, to watch. And what she saw ended any doubt. A column of water had formed above the city, not a natural whirlpool, but a tower made of spiraling current. And in its center, a shadow. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't alive. But it moved. A structure rising from the seafloor, spinning slowly against gravity. It had no edges, no doors, only light bending wrong. She knew what it was. The artifact. It was no longer content with silence. She went to the chamber one final time. The statues were gone. The spiral had split into two, a mirrored loop. Inside the central column, her grandfather no longer spoke. Only a whisper echoed. It remembers. The chamber cracked along the seams, and she saw them, the 12, the architects, now faceless, now identical. Their consciousness merged, their punishment unending. Each of them had given up identity to become a lock. And Eleni? She was their undoing. Their legacy had failed, because the artifact hadn't just infected memory. It had waited for something it could use, a mind encoded by design. A lineage bred with precision. A key born of water, bound by memory. Eleni wasn't chosen. She was built. She surfaced to a sky without stars. The moon was gone. Or hiding. The waves rose higher now. Not fast, but steady. Like the sea rising to greet something. Or rejoin something. In the town below, the power went out. Phones stopped working. Compass needles spun. The tide refused to return. Everything paused, and then the wind said her name. She turned to the cliffside, and there, on the horizon, the shadow turned. It saw her, not with eyes, with recognition. She ran to the only place that still made sense, the ruins of the monastery. And there, among the collapsed stones and burned-out candles, she found the original binding, not of a book, of a scroll tied in serpent leather, sealed with dried blood. Inside it, 12 names, and a 13th space. Waiting. She knew. The final lock had not yet been sealed, because it was her. The artifact had waited for someone who could remember, but it had also waited for someone who could choose. Eleni stood beneath the storm, the shadow now rising higher than the sea. Not physical, conceptual, time torn into form. It shimmered, it pulled. She looked at the scroll, and wrote her name. The wind screamed, the storm broke, and the sea began to fall. Not as rain, as memory. Moments flooded her mind, lives not her own, voices lost to history, wars never written, love never spoken. The artifact screamed, and for the first time in 5,000 years, the city resisted. Stone groaned beneath the waves, the chamber sealed, the spiral closed, and the structure stopped spinning. Not destroyed, bound, by her. Eleni collapsed at the shoreline, salt in her lungs, blood on her fingers, tears she couldn't explain. She had locked it again, but at what cost? She heard the whisper of her grandfather, not in the air, in her. You're not the end, child. You're the hinge, and hinges open both ways. Time has looped so many times, you forgot you created the city. It began again. Not the voices, not the visions, the knowing, the taste of stone and salt in her mouth, the ache in her bones that didn't belong to a 32-year-old woman from Athens. The way her fingers traced spirals she had never been taught to draw, only to realize she had drawn them once in another life, with tools now lost to the sea. The sea didn't just whisper anymore. It remembered her, and she at last began to remember it. Eleni stood on the shore of Pavlopetri, the sun hidden behind a curtain of ash-colored clouds. The city below the waves had fallen quiet again, but not out of peace. No, this was not peace. It was waiting. She had resealed the artifact. She had rewritten the code that threatened to unhinge the world. But something still pulsed in her chest, an echo, soft but steady. A question older than language. Who are you really? She had asked it 100 times. And now the answer came, not in words, but in returning. The memories didn't arrive as dreams this time. They fell like rain. Scattered, sudden, unstoppable. One moment she was rinsing her hands in seawater, and the next she was somewhere else. Not now. Not here. She stood barefoot on ancient marble, cloaked in robes of blue-gray linen. Her fingers were stained with iron dust. Her skin smelled of crushed myrrh. Before her stretched a city not yet buried, vibrant and alive, lit by fires that never smoked, adorned with flags that shimmered like glass. It was Pavlopetri. Before the seal, before the fracture, before the betrayal, she was Lysithea. Not a name she had read, a name she was. The last voice in the circle of architects. The only one who still believed the machine could be reworked. Not to preserve lives, but to preserve choice. The others had surrendered. She had stayed, and she had offered the final lock. Her life, her memory, herself. But what no one had realized, not even her, was that death would not undo her role. The city had stored too much of her. Her thought, her voice, her echo. So when the seal broke, she returned. Not summoned, rewritten, reborn. Eleni opened her eyes in the present, gasping. It wasn't just a myth. She had died here, and now she lived again. Because the city, the machine, had looped once more. This wasn't the first time Pavlopetri had awoken. It was one in a cycle, a loop spanning centuries. Each time it called her back. Each time she remembered too late. And now, for the first time in millennia, she remembered in time. She walked the seabed one last time. The chamber stood open. The spiral on her wrist now pulsed softly, not in pain, in recognition. She approached the center column. The oracle appeared once more, not behind glass. Beside her, no longer a guardian, but a mirror. You remember, the oracle said. Eleni nodded. I've lived this before. Many times. And failed. The oracle didn't speak. She didn't need to. The weight of failure lived in the ruins. The memories stitched themselves together. Each version of her. Each iteration. Each woman who answered the call and tried, in love, in sacrifice, in desperation, to hold the seal. One drowned. One went mad. One left and forgot. One opened the chamber willingly. This version of her, Eleni, had come further than any before. But now the loop narrowed. There was only one choice left. She asked the oracle, "Why me? Why keep bringing me back?" "Because you are the hinge," the oracle whispered. "You are the part of the machine that feels, that chooses, that forgives." Eleni stepped toward the core. "The seal is failing." "Yes. And if I sink the city again," the oracle cut her off. "You go with it, fully, finally." Eleni looked toward the surface. Light shimmered above. The memory stream had calmed, but only just. The artifact, the ancient, shifting structure beneath the seabed, had paused. But it hadn't been silenced. Not permanently. It would wait again, grow stronger, until the next awakening. Unless she made the final lock herself. No more rebirths. No more loops. Only stillness. She thought of her grandfather. Of the day she first dove into the ruins. Of the child in her dreams who had sung a lullaby only she remembered. Of the storm that had exposed a city not meant for daylight. Of the shadow that had seen her and known. The oracle held out a small object. Not metal, not stone. A sphere of transparent memory. A final seed. "Place it at the center," she said, "and let yourself go." Eleni took it. It was weightless. And inside it, all the versions of her. Every memory, every sacrifice, every failure. But also of beauty. And the one thing the machine had never learned to store. Forgiveness. She walked into the center of the chamber. Laid the seed into the pedestal. The spirals around her illuminated. The chamber glowed. And time paused. The sea above her shimmered gold. The current stopped spinning. The structure in the deep began to sink. Not by force. By choice. The city, too, began to lower itself back into the dark. Not erased, but held. Gently. As if memory itself were tucking Pavlopetri back into dream. Eleni knelt. She closed her eyes. And whispered, "Let it rest." Then silence. The kind that isn't empty, but final. Above the surface, the sky cleared. The tide returned. The shadow vanished. And on the shore, no trace of her remained, except a single shell, carved with a spiral, left on the sand, waiting for no one. They say the sea forgets, but Pavlopetri remembers. It remembers every step taken on its sunken streets, every name spoken aloud, then lost, every mind entrusted to its memory stream, every echo that tried to scream before silence dragged it under. And now it remembers her, Lysophia, Eleni, the woman who died before she was born, the hinge between endings. She had made the final choice, to become the seal, and the sea, ever faithful in its strange, unfeeling way, obeyed. But the world does not go quiet without protest. The ritual had only begun. The artifact in the depths did not rage. It sang, not with music, with memory. Its song was one long, aching note, rippling upward through the currents, bending the light around it like grief distorting truth. It rose from the abyss one last time, not as structure or shadow, but as idea. And the sky turned red, not with storm, but with the sorrow of the past surfacing all at once. Birds vanished. Fish swam backward. Compass needles bent inward and cracked. The wind stilled, and the tide dropped until the seabed bled itself dry, and then it held still, like the breath of something immense preparing to exhale. The seal had held, but the sea was remembering. Eleni's body rested deep in the chamber, curled against the pedestal where the seed had been planted. Her heart no longer beat. Her lungs had long stopped tasting air. But her mind remained, because Pavlopetri would not let her go. Not until she saw everything. Not until the full weight of 5,000 years had been poured through her. The lives returned, not in flashes but in floods. She felt them all. The first builders, singing as they laid the foundation stones, not knowing what slept below. The child who painted stars on her bedroom wall and forgot her mother's name the next day. The soldier who whispered his final prayer into the water before drowning beside his enemy. The woman who tried to unbind her husband's memory from the chamber and ended up losing her own. The oracle, the cartographer, the architect who begged to be forgotten and became the one memory the city couldn't let go. She felt love, rage, regret, wonder. And then, the moment the seal first broke, the screaming, the light, the first fracture, the wave of forgetting that unmade their names, the silence that followed, and then the loop, and again, and again. Each time, the sea selected a carrier. Each time, the carrier failed, or delayed, or fell too soon. Until Eleni, who had chosen to stay. The ritual reached its crescendo. The spiral beneath her body lit gold, then violet, then black. The walls pulsed with a final chorus of voices, not crying for salvation, simply singing. For once, the city wasn't begging to be saved. It was saying goodbye. And then it stopped. The red sky softened. The sea exhaled. The artifact, the being, the breach, the watcher, sank without resistance, folding inward, pulling its own thoughts with it. Not banished, but returned. To dreamless sleep. The city, its halls, its archives, its ghosts, sighed. And was still. Days passed. Then weeks. Tourists returned to the Laconian coast. The sea no longer shimmered strangely. The sun no longer vanished without warning. The sonar scans found only rock and coral. The ruins, when viewed, appeared empty. No pulse, no sound, just ruin. And Eleni? Her name faded from memory like salt from stone. She was never reported missing. No belongings found. No record of her being there. Almost as if she never had been. But the sea remembered. It happened on a calm morning. A man, young, inexperienced, dove from a rented boat with second-hand gear, chasing rumors of a sunken city for a university paper he wouldn't finish. He drifted downward, found nothing but sand, was about to surface, when something whispered, a sound, so insistent, his name, whispered in his own voice. Turned, saw nothing, But behind his eyes, something stirred. A memory. A place he'd never seen. Streets beneath water. A woman in blue. A spiral on stone. He surfaced, shivering. The boat rocked gently. The wind picked up. And across the water, the seaside, somewhere, far below, beneath layers of sediment and forgotten ritual, a single spiral glowed. Just faintly. Not in warning, but in remembrance. Because Pavlopetri had done what it was built to do. It had sealed the wound, held the artifact, preserved the cost, and let one truth remain. The past cannot be forgotten, only carried. They say the sea forgets, but some memories were never meant to be lost. And so, the waves fall quiet once more. But silence in Pavlopetri is never empty. It listens, remembers, it waits. Beneath the still waters, where cities sleep and time itself has teeth, something ancient stirs, not in anger nor in mercy, but in knowing. Because some truths were never written in stone, only in blood, in breath, in memory. You've journeyed through shadows older than history, walked corridors where names no longer echo, and glimpsed a city that lived beyond time, and yet, somehow, was always watching you. But what if Pavlopetri was only the beginning? There are other cities that whisper when no one listens. Other maps inked in DNA. Other seas that remember the things we swore we'd forget. If this tale has moved something in you, a question, a chill, a memory you're not sure is yours, then follow that feeling. Like this story, if your heart still beats a little slower. Comment if your dreams carry ruins you've never seen. Share this with someone who's ever stared too long at the ocean. And subscribe, because this world is ancient, yes, but it is far from finished. Timeless tales wait in the dark, and they never truly end. They just wait for the right voice to find them again. We'll be here, where memory sleeps and wakes.